Psychology of Gen Z, the most misunderstood generation. Who exactly is Gen Z? Generation Z includes everyone born between 1997 and 2012. That makes them between 13 and 27 years old today. They are the largest generation in human history, making up over 32% of the entire global population. But numbers alone do not tell the real story of who Gen Z truly is. What makes Gen Z fundamentally different from every generation before them is one simple but profound fact: they are the first generation to grow up entirely in the digital age. They have never known a world without smartphones. They have never experienced life without social media. They have never had to wait for information because the entire knowledge of humanity has always been available to them instantly at their fingertips. But here is the deeper psychological truth that most people miss. Gen Z did not just grow up alongside technology the way millennials did. Technology was not something Gen Z adopted, it was something they were born into. It became the very foundation through which they learned to communicate, to think, to form relationships, and to understand the world around them. Psychologists call them the first true digital natives, and that distinction changes absolutely everything. Because when technology shapes a child's brain during its most critical developmental years, it does not just change their habits. It fundamentally rewires how their minds work, how they process emotions, how they form identities, and how they relate to other human beings. To truly understand Gen Z, you must first understand that you are not dealing with just a different generation. You are dealing with a genuinely different kind of human mind, one shaped by forces that have never existed before in all of human history. The anxiety generation. If there is one psychological label that science most consistently applies to Gen Z, it is this: they are the most anxious generation ever recorded in human history. The statistics are impossible to ignore. Studies from the American Psychological Association show that over 70% of Gen Z report experiencing significant anxiety and depression. Rates of psychological distress among Gen Z are dramatically higher than those reported by millennials, Generation X, or baby boomers at the exact same age. Clinical diagnoses of anxiety disorders, depression, and other mental health conditions have skyrocketed among young people over the past decade at a rate that has genuinely alarmed psychologists and mental health professionals worldwide. But to truly understand Gen Z anxiety, you cannot just look at the numbers. You have to understand the world they grew up in. Social media and the comparison trap. Gen Z grew up in a world where their social worth was measured in likes, followers, and comments from the time they were children. Every single day their developing brains were bombarded with perfectly curated, heavily filtered highlight reels of other people's lives. Beautiful bodies. Perfect relationships. Exotic vacations. Flawless skin. Effortless success. Their brains learned from a very early age to constantly measure themselves against these impossible and completely artificial standards. Psychologists call this social comparison theory, and research consistently shows that chronic social comparison is one of the most powerful destroyers of self-esteem and mental well-being ever studied. For Gen Z, this comparison was not occasional. It was constant, relentless, and began before many of them were even teenagers, growing up in a world on fire. But social media is only part of the story. Gen Z also had the profound misfortune of growing up during one of the most unstable and frightening periods in modern history. They were children during the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. They watched their parents lose jobs, homes, and financial security. They grew up under the constant shadow of climate change, regularly told by scientists that the planet they would inherit was heading toward catastrophe. They experienced school shootings as a normalized part of their childhood reality. They lived through a global pandemic that shut down the entire world during what should have been some of the most socially important years of their lives. Each of these events left deep psychological scars. And the cumulative weight of all of them together created a level of background anxiety in Gen Z that has no real parallel in any previous generation's experience. The loss of real human connection. There is a third and often overlooked factor driving Gen Z anxiety: the gradual replacement of real-world human connection with digital interaction. Human beings are wired for face-to-face connection. We need physical presence, genuine eye contact, real touch, and authentic shared experience to develop healthy emotional regulation and psychological resilience. These are not luxuries, they are fundamental biological needs. Because so much of Gen Z's social life happened through screens rather than in person, many individuals in this generation never fully developed the emotional coping skills, the conflict resolution abilities, and the deep sense of belonging that come naturally from real-world human relationships. The result is a generation that is simultaneously deeply connected to the entire world and yet profoundly disconnected from the basic human experiences their psychology was designed to need. The most socially aware generation. Here is one of the biggest and most unfair misconceptions about Gen Z: that they are selfish, self-absorbed, and only care about themselves. Science and psychology tell a completely and powerfully different story. Generation Z is without question the most socially aware and socially conscious generation ever studied by psychologists and sociologists. And the evidence for this is overwhelming. A generation that cares deeply. Research consistently shows that Gen Z cares more intensely about social justice, racial equality, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, mental health awareness, climate change, and economic inequality than any generation that came before them. But more importantly, they do not just care in theory. They act on what they care about in ways that have already produced real and measurable change in the world. Gen Z powered some of the most significant social movements of the 21st century. From the global climate strikes inspired by Greta Thunberg that brought millions of young people into the streets demanding action on climate change, to the explosive growth of mental health awareness campaigns that have fundamentally transformed how society talks about psychological well-being, to youth-led movements for gun control, racial justice, and political accountability that have forced genuine conversations at the highest levels of government and society. This is not a generation that simply posts about issues and moves on. This is a generation that has demonstrated a remarkable and sustained willingness to put their time, their energy, their voices, and their futures on the line for causes they believe in. Why Gen Z cares so much? Psychologists have a clear explanation for why Gen Z developed such extraordinary levels of social consciousness. Previous generations grew up in information environments that were largely local. The news you received was filtered through a relatively small number of television channels and newspapers. The problems you were aware of were mostly the problems of your immediate community, your city, or your country. Gen Z grew up with a smartphone in their hands and the unfiltered pain of the entire world streaming directly into their consciousness from the time they were children. They saw the faces of refugees. They watched videos of police brutality. They read first-hand accounts of discrimination, poverty, and injustice from people on the other side of the planet. They witnessed environmental destruction in real time. Their empathy was not cultivated in a classroom or a church. It was forged through years of direct, unmediated exposure to the full spectrum of human suffering and human injustice on a global scale. And that exposure created something psychologists rarely see so consistently expressed across an entire generation: a deep, genuine, and personally felt sense of moral responsibility for the state of the world. The authenticity demand. One of the most psychologically interesting expressions of Gen Z's social awareness is their fierce and uncompromising demand for authenticity. Gen Z grew up watching corporations, politicians, and public figures say one thing and do another. They developed extraordinarily sensitive psychological radar for hypocrisy, performative activism, and empty gestures. They can identify inauthenticity almost instantly, and they respond to it with immediate and often very public rejection. This is why brands that try to appear socially conscious without genuine commitment consistently fail with Gen Z audiences. This is why politicians who speak in polished but empty language struggle to connect with young voters. How Gen Z thinks differently. Perhaps the most scientifically fascinating aspect of Generation Z is what cognitive psychologists have discovered about how their brains actually process information, and how fundamentally different that processing is from every generation that came before them. The selective attention myth. The most common criticism leveled at Gen Z is that they have no attention span. Older generations love to point to their inability to sit through long meetings, lengthy lectures, or slow-moving content as proof that they are intellectually shallow or intellectually lazy. Cognitive psychology completely dismantles this criticism. What Gen Z has developed is not a short attention span. What they have developed is an extraordinarily powerful and highly sophisticated selective attention system. Growing up in an environment of genuinely infinite content, where millions of videos, articles, posts, and messages compete for attention every single second, their brains adapted in a remarkable way. They developed the ability to process enormous amounts of incoming information with incredible speed and to make rapid and highly accurate judgments about what deserves deeper attention and what does not. Studies show that Gen Z can evaluate the credibility, relevance, and value of a piece of content in as little as 8 seconds. Not because they are shallow, but because their brains have been trained through years of experience to be extraordinarily efficient information processors. And here is the crucial part that older generations consistently miss: when Gen Z encounters content, a subject, a cause, or a relationship that they genuinely find meaningful and engaging, they are capable of extraordinarily deep, sustained and passionate focus. The attention is there. It simply requires genuine substance to activate it. Critical thinking as a survival skill. Another remarkable cognitive difference that psychologists have identified in Gen Z. The emotional intelligence advantage. Finally, psychologists consistently note that Gen Z demonstrates unusually high levels of emotional intelligence for their age, particularly around recognizing and articulating complex emotional states, empathizing with people whose experiences are radically different from their own, and maintaining psychological awareness of how their behavior affects others. Growing up in an environment where mental health was openly discussed, where diverse human experiences were constantly visible, and where emotional vulnerability was increasingly normalized gave Gen Z an emotional vocabulary and emotional awareness that previous generations simply did not have access to at the same stage of development. This emotional intelligence, combined with their cognitive flexibility and their powerful social consciousness, creates a psychological profile that is genuinely unlike anything researchers have observed in previous generations. We just hope after today you will understand the psychology of Z generation. Subscribe our channel and also give us a like for more daily dark psychology videos. Best of luck, God bless you.